Hello and welcome to this special report from ZenootTV. I'm Nick Peters. Now, earlier this year, the Institute for Prosperity was launched. Its express goal is campaigning to increase manufacturing share of GDP from 10% to 15%. It's an ambition we would all share and applaud, I'm sure. The Institute was founded by John Mills of the JML Group. He's a prominent Labour Party donor and he was also a founder of the Vote Leave campaign. The board of advisors is drawn from right across the political spectrum. It includes sitting MPs and peers, and is chaired by Caroline Flint, who until December 2019 was the Labour MP for Don Valley. She also held several ministerial positions under Prime Ministers Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and was a member of Ed Miliband's shadow cabinet. Caroline Flint, a very warm welcome to the programme. How do you propose that this country can increase its manufacturing base by 50%, and how long do you think it's going to take?
Well, I certainly think we need the ambition, because when you look at other countries like Germany and Switzerland, where their share of their economy in terms of manufacturing is 20%, we're around 10%. I think getting to 15% is definitely something we should work towards. It can't happen overnight. For any strategy to have an impact, it has to be sustained. But certainly the amount of investment, national investment we put into this area, skills, infrastructure, but importantly, I think a mindset which has to both celebrate what is already being done in manufacturing, but also answering the question about why we can't do more, is something that I, as part of this Institute for Prosperity that I'm chairing, want to achieve over the next few years. And that's why it's cross-party, because we believe that's the best way to try and get some consensus on the foundation issues that manufacturing really needs to help them grow.
Well, I hope you'll forgive just a touch of, I won't say cynicism, but there are so many organisations in the manufacturing sector devoted to improving the visibility of manufacturing, people's understanding of manufacturing, government's understanding of manufacturing. How is yours aiming to be heard when others are not necessarily getting the ear of government as much as they might?
You're absolutely right, Nick. There are a multitude of organisations working in this area, and they're doing some really good work representing many diverse interests across what we call manufacturing. I know that only too well as a Member of Parliament for 22 years. I've been lobbied on many occasions by many of those different groups. Some of them in 22 years have re-emerged and changed their name from their titles in the past. I think it's a really good question. Given the number of organisations that exist, trade associations, skills associations, financial investment groups, that have all been knocking at government's door of different colours for many years, why is it we haven't made the inroads that we should to recognise how important manufacturing is, not only to the wealth of our country? If we can't create things to sell, we can't create wealth to help pay for things like the NHS and other public services. But for me, it's about recognising the importance of manufacturing bases in our communities outside of our cities to help them feel they have a stake in our national endeavour and our future. And so I think our group isn't trying to take away from anything those other organisations have done and achieved in many respects over the years, but really to try and find a way through having this cross-party political grouping, as well as people who are economists and also manufacturers as well involved in it, to try and address what is it about the political environment that, despite all these experts lobbying ministers and MPs, isn't really delivering exactly what manufacturing wants. And I think, since the Institute was launched, since I was made chair of the advisory board, quite rightly, Nick, people have said, well, who are you? What do you do? What do you know? And I don't claim to be an expert about everything, but I do know about politics and how policies are made. And I hope what we can do is try to amplify those voices and ask the question, given all this knowledge, given all this power, given all this expertise, why aren't we doing better to make sure those voices are heard? So I hope we can just amplify more than anything else.
How much of is your adherence to this cause informed by life in your former constituency?
Very much so. Doncaster, like many towns in the Midlands and the North, and if I think of my husband as well, who's from Teesside, his father worked in the chemical industry for many years before actually he was made redundant in that area a number of decades ago now. But in Doncaster, one only has to think about, yes, coal mining, but also the rail industry to know how much the skills of industry, of manufacturing were very much part of what made Doncaster the place it was. And of course, all those supply chains into those major industries as well. And for me, something I've thought about very deeply over the last couple of decades is what happened when those big industries declined in coal, as one example, is there wasn't really enough attention given to what could we do as a country, not to replace coal, in the sense that we could. That wasn't going to be possible. That volume, one big industry that employed, let's be honest, men predominantly, and with climate change and everything else, was going to have to change. But not much was done to really think about how for Doncaster it could be supported to reinvent itself. Now, having said that, Nick, I can look over the last 20 years and look at some of the changes that have happened, some really good news stories in Doncaster when it comes to manufacturing. But to be honest, it's not enough to make the impact that towns like Doncaster want to make. And more than anything, what are sometimes called those left behind communities that aren't the cities, aren't the university towns, they want a stake in the country's future. And I think manufacturing is one of those areas which doesn't depend necessarily on being in London and the southeast. With the right sort of support in infrastructure, in energy, in skills, we can actually help those towns to become part much more of our economic future. So it's about what's right for the country, but I have a personal passionate interest in this because I think those manufacturing jobs are usually better paid jobs than many in the service sector. And actually where we have SMEs involved in that area, they really do dig into communities and very much feel part of it, which is, I think, another part of this type of project. We want companies to be able to feel part of the communities, not just sitting there for a while before they move somewhere else. And I think that's where manufacturing, again, can play such an important role, and does in many communities, and does in parts of Doncaster already.
Let's take this a little bit further. I want to get on to deindustrialization in a broader sense in a moment. But just picking up on what you're saying about communities, what we feel is that ever since the big factories left towns and cities, due to deindustrialization, smaller manufacturing grew up outside of towns and cities. So a lot of people don't even know it's there. It's sort of sitting on an industrial estate or a business park. And there is a chance to reconnect manufacturing with communities. Certainly that's what many of us in this sector feel. I'm wondering if there's anything that you can do or anything that you would advocate that would accelerate that.
Well, I think part of it is, as well as pointing out the challenges, is celebrating the success stories and saying, why isn't there more of that? Your website, the programs that you produce are about challenge, but they are also about celebrating what is already happening. And I just think we don't hear enough of that. Look, if I think about in Parliament, about the discussions about manufacturing, let's be honest about it, it's usually about the car industry and not much else. That sounds terrible, but it's true. And it's not that the car industry isn't important and Nissan isn't important and Jaguar isn't important. Of course they are. But manufacturing is so much more than that. And I think when we actually get that sort of sense of awareness of what some of those, if you like, those companies are doing and producing, then I think it gives a sense of awareness, but also an understanding of the problems they face, which may be very different to the problems of someone like Nissan and Jaguar. Important those organisations are. I mean, if I think again about the constituency I represented, for me, going to businesses and particularly in the SME sort of areas and hearing what they have overcome in many respects over the last 20 years has been inspiring. If I think of Amiga, which is a kitchen manufacturer in my constituency, One of the, I think one of the most best kitchen manufacturers in the country in the independent sector, that over years they invested in equipment, plant, technology, and it led to bringing jobs back to the UK, where they were outshoring parts of their work overseas to other parts of Europe. They actually brought that back in. When we went through the financial crash, many of these smaller firms found all sorts of ways to keep their workers still employed within the organisation. I can think of a foundry that produces, for example, aluminium light fittings that probably in lots of offices around the UK. They had to really think about how they held on to that workforce during a really difficult time. And then they lost a contract to China, but they won the contract back from China when the quality of what was being done wasn't as good as what they could provide, and that much closer relationship to their customer base. So there are some amazing stories from companies that probably people haven't really heard of, who are out there making stuff and making a living and providing work embedded within communities that gives pride to that community as well. And I think, part of it is how do we give expression to that and talk about that, but importantly, find the space to talk about the particular problems they face that are very different to the big global manufacturing giants that exist in our country.
Well, I think you'd hear a lot of people saying here to all of that. Just talking about deindustrialization and the sort of last 30, 40 years, if you like, it's as if this country, lost faith in manufacturing, but also grew to believe that services, and particularly financial services, would be our savior. And the economy has kind of grown around that concept. And that concept is the way it's grown around that concept is actually detrimental to the way manufacturing needs things like investment, exchange rates, and so on. And I'm wondering if that's going to be part of your messaging.
Oh, absolutely. I think somewhere along the way, and it didn't happen overnight, it's been happening, John Mills, who has set up the Institute for Prosperity, talks about the last 40 years. In fact, he's written a book, The Elephant Room, that takes us right back to the Industrial Revolution. For anybody watching this who wants to read it, it's a really interesting read about this journey that our country's been on. But definitely, I think in the last 40 years, and I recognise this when, Labour got elected in 97, the buzz was all about the knowledge economy. It was all about globalization and a sort of sense that, we couldn't resist or support in any way fewer jobs being outsourced overseas. I think we saw a downgrading of apprenticeships and that sort of, if you like, vocational skill base. Ironically, Nick, and maybe it's a sign of my age, I almost think actually the changing of polytechnics to universities somehow again lost that voice for vocational education within it. And we've been trying to catch up sort of ever since. It's clear to me that, we're not going to stop products that British people buy all be coming from abroad. There's always going to be that trade back and forth. But for me, it's also about looking at other countries that are doing better. And, Germany is often pointed to as a country where not only does it invest hugely in manufacturing, but actually, interestingly, it's always cited as having good employment laws and other rules about how we manufacture in terms of health and safety. That hasn't stopped it having 20% of its economy and economic output being from manufacturing. And it seems to me that's where we can aspire to. You've maybe had this on your programme already, Nick, but I sometimes like those sort of killer facts almost. And then someone will tell me it's not the fact, I've got it wrong. But at the start of the pandemic, something only like 1% of personal protective equipment was made here in the UK. I was looking at some figures the other week. It's gone up to 70%. We're doing amazing things in terms of vaccines. People have actually been pretty entrepreneurial actually in shifting what they currently produce to meet the needs of this pandemic in different ways. And it would be really a lost opportunity if that endeavour that ability, that agility was somehow lost, and we went backwards when we get to grips with this pandemic with a vaccine. And work isn't going to be the same in the future, we know that. But we have shown in the really most seriousness of times that on manufacturing we can still make a difference. So let's harness that and do more.
Well, I think you'd hear quite a howl of outrage from the manufacturing sector at the fact that the government was informed time and time again by UK companies that they could pivot with the agility you've just paid credit to create PPE. They were ignored in favour of large-scale contracts which went overseas. And I think there's some resentment, and the fact that the Ventilator Challenge UK turned on a sixpence in a time of lockdown to produce ventilators for the NHS was absolutely brilliant. And as you say, we all hope, not just hope, we will be deeply upset if it doesn't happen, that this is recognised and is taken as evidence of the resilience of the sector. Another quick point arising out of this big, growing obsession we had over 30, 40 years, I wouldn't say obsession, focus, let's put it that way, on financial services. It's almost as if we've turned into a country that requires a quick turnaround for our money, short-termers and quick buck culture. Manufacturing needs long-term capital, patient capital, and support and investment. And I do hope, I'm sure the sector would agree with me, that part of your portfolio of ideas will be to promote long-termism in investment.
Absolutely. Part of my career was spent being Shadow Secretary for Energy and Climate Change under Ed Miliband, and I did that for four years. I also was a housing minister under the Labour government. And what that certainly taught me, more than I realised before, was how certainty about the direction of travel is so important in terms of getting the investment in and, creating the skill base you need to be able to provide our energy, keep the lights on, keep us warm, as well as build the homes that we want. I was very proud to have been the housing minister, to work with the construction industry and others on the zero carbon home agenda. It was daunting at the time, we're going back to 2007 now, but what the industry said to me is, look, we're obviously not quite sure how we're going to get there, but we know that's where we need to go. Work with us and support us, and we can help deliver this. Energy is another example. We know we have to decarbonise our energy supply, and whether it's nuclear or renewables or hydrogen or other forms of cleaner energy, you need to give a sense of where we're going. And that's what manufacturing needs as well, that certainty. And government can do that in many different ways. Part of the climate change challenge for government is going to be how it supports manufacturing to be able to be part of that, how they can change their practices, how we can get ahead of producing the products that we're going to need to buy more of and less of the others that have been dirtier in the past. There are a whole number of ways in which government can make a difference there. And going to your point earlier, Nick, procurement is a really important part of what government does as well. And one of the criticisms government has been, and I think it's still a problem, is when they package up contracts in such large numbers, it's quite difficult for different firms to come in. And they've talked often about remodeling the way they package contracts to allow smaller firms to come in. And actually, there's nothing wrong with having a group of firms maybe producing something rather than one monolith that does the job, which then means it gets outsourced overseas. So I think this is crucially important to how we plan for the future. But what we really need is allowing the different political parties to finesse these areas of policy is always going to have to happen. But I do believe, a bit like our National Health Service or setting up a pension scheme, when it comes to an industrial strategy, particularly on manufacturing, we need to have some cross-party consensus on the fundamentals that can outlive one parliament or two parliaments. We need to create that bedrock that enables us all to know that wherever there is a change of control, that will still be going forward. It still allows for some diversity. It still allows for political parties to finesse what they want to do. But we do need to get some cross-party consensus. And that's where myself, Vince Cable, John Penrose, Labour MPs, Tory MPs and others, peers in the House of Lords as well as the House of Commons, want to try and encourage that dialogue and some agreement to allow us to move forward in a productive way.
Well, we wish you all the very best of luck, Caroline, in that endeavour. It's very important to all of us and, of course, to the national economy. Caroline Flint, thank you very much indeed for being with us. And a quick note to anybody watching, John Mills, who founded the Institute for Prosperity, will be our guest on Kaizen Central on Thursday evening at 6 o'clock. Watch out, I'll be putting out some information about that on social media. This has been a special report from ZenootTV. I'm Nick Peters. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.